Again, here on New England Lifestyles, part of the Odyssey Network. I'm Mike Mullaney, your host, and we talked about a lot of things. Whether it be fundraisers, whether it be things to watch for, whether it be political conversations. But I think the conversation that all of us can most relate to, if you have kids, is the fact that you vacillate from feeling like the best parent in the world to feeling like the worst parent in the world, because kids are not easy. We're going to talk about kids and, how to really, raise your kids without getting into these terrible skirmishes, because these things can happen. And joining us on the phone is parenting expert Laura Lynn Knight, a former elementary school teacher and a certified positive discipline educator. She specializes in helping families create calmer home environments. Laura Lynn, welcome to the radio station.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here, and I completely relate to kids being the best thing in the world and then just driving you so nuts sometimes.
It is funny, it's just like, the exact things that you want from your children, the things that you want them to be. You want them to be efficient adults. You want them to be independent thinkers. You want them to, be able to reason and make choices for themselves. But once they start doing it, you realize that it sets off a chain reaction of bad stuff, because suddenly you're not in control of these kids. And look, you don't want to be in control of the kids. You want to just guide them through. But gosh, it is not easy.
I had a classroom for a long time. I was an elementary school teacher, and I would have 25 kids every day, all year long. And it was so much easier than having just my two.
Isn't it funny?
So that's why I got into this parenting work, because I, too, need the tools. But I'm really happy to report my daughter is 6 and my son is 8 now. And our home on most days is really calm and not reactive, and it's such a gift. So it's possible. It's possible for all of us.
And hopefully, I got my fingers crossed for you when they get older, because I have 3, 19, 16, and 15. And
okay.
Have you ever seen the 4th of July fireworks?
Yeah, I have.
It's like that a lot of the time. So, and obviously, as kids get older, the issues change. But I think that one of the things that you're talking about is the way you communicate with kids and set boundaries for kids is something that should permeate the entire window of when you're raising them, because consistency is such an important part of being a parent, isn't it?
Absolutely. And so when we look at the different models of parenting, we have authoritarian parenting. So that's kind of, you live under my roof, you're going to do as I say. We see a lot of rebellion later on in the teenage years with that kind of parenting. We have permissive parenting, kind of letting them do what they want. But again, a lot of those children feel unseen or neglected, and later on will rebel in other ways. And then there's this middle ground of authoritative parenting, and that's the kindness, but with the limits, with the boundaries and the routines in place. And what the research shows and what I see from the work that I do with parents is that later on in the teenage years and into adulthood, those children really thrive, and their social emotional well-being is good. They're doing really well.
And while we discuss this today, I want to direct everybody to a website, Laura Lynn Knight, and Lynn is Linn, lauralynnknight.com. And it has a bunch of information here. It's funny how when we talk about the parenting approach, there are so many ways. And one of the things that I think that people need to realize is how they are raised plays a huge role in how you raise your kids. For example, my wife is a Vietnamese refugee. Came over, very, very strict parents, demanded a lot from her. She, when she and I dated for 7 years before we got married, she never once spent a night with me because she was raised to never, ever do that. She was very, 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 I used to make the joke that her mother had the longest umbilical cords of all time. Because it was, the family was very strict and they had very clear rules, and they all succeeded well, but it was strict, you know what I mean? I, on the other hand, was raised by a father who was an alcoholic. He was never there for me ever. So when I was going to become a parent, I was going to become the perfect parent who was always there for my kids, loved their kids, and made sure every holiday was perfect, because none of mine were. So when we had kids, suddenly there was a clash of cultures. I wanted to make every day perfect. She wanted to make the kids perfect. And it was an interesting way things happen. How do parents bring their two schools of how they are raised and how they want to become parents? How does that, I mean, I think that conversation and how parents work together is one of the key things that's going to define not only how the kids are raised, but also how the marriage is going to go.
Yes, absolutely. And when parents come together and they can sit down and they have a conversation of what are our long-term goals. Imagine our child knocks on the door and they're 20 years old and we open the door. What qualities do we want to see in our child? And that can kind of help dictate, okay, well, what are we doing today? What boundaries and limits and type of parenting are we doing today that's going to help them to succeed in the future? And I encourage parents that I work with to sit down and make a list of the behaviors that are not working for them, the behaviors that they were raised with that they don't want to repeat. So if it was yelling, if it was shame and guilt, if there was too much rigidity or too much permissiveness, to make that list on the left-hand side of a piece of paper. And then on the right-hand side, what are the new strategies that we would like to adopt as parents in our home? Do we want to...
I was going to say, it's really interesting to how that conversation comes up, because so many questions. And again, I'll go back to my marriage. My wife was raised without really a structured religion. I was raised Roman Catholic, and it's not so much that I'm raising the flag saying I think the Catholic Church is perfect, but when we decided to raise the kids, I said to her, "Are you happy having no religious base?" She said no, and I was happy that I had it, so it was an easy decision. We went with the one that worked better. So it's like same thing with us when we set up the boundaries. She was a much stricter parent, so I kind of let her become the person who kind of dictated the way the kids were going to get raised, and I would bounce off it and be the voice of if you want to talk, come talk to me. So it's an interesting thing where you realize that parents need to have these conversations in advance, having those strategies, conversations and figuring out a strategy rather than winging it. Boy, does that matter.
Absolutely. And so I love the idea of a family meeting for the parents. So we do family meetings with our kids where we sit down and we problem solve. So we see there's an issue. Let's say, okay, notice that chores aren't getting done. Let's all sit down. Let's talk about the chores. Let's problem solve how we're going to get them done, and we're going to try the solution. But when I started doing that work with my children, I realized, this is the perfect opportunity to have these same family meetings with my husband. And so my husband and I now, we sit down and have our family meetings without the kids where we can really talk things through, brainstorm, and we have a format for that works. And that was one of the gifts of just learning these parenting tools, that it made my relationship and my marriage so much stronger and healthier.
Well, that's interesting. So, I mean, and that's one of the things. When you have that conversation, it doesn't necessarily mean it's always going to be a fruitful conversation, because so many people really... You don't realize how much you have to sacrifice in a relationship. Just because you want something doesn't mean that's what is going to happen. And you have to realize you have to be willing to accept the other person's perspectives on things. And that's hard for people as they go into relationships, because so much of what we do early on in life revolves around me. So what is that strategy? How do you approach that meeting?
Well, our family meetings, with kids or without kids, always look the same. We share an appreciation for anyone who's at the table. We keep them short. We focus on one topic at a time. And we say that all ideas are welcome. So we don't always have to come up with a solution right then and there, but it can definitely be put on the table. And that allows everyone to feel heard. Now, when it comes to my husband and I, it might need to be a multiple conversation until we can reach an agreement. And you're absolutely right. It might not be all one person's way. There's, of course, that give and take. And with the kids, we'll sit down, we'll have our appreciations, we'll have our family meeting, and then we'll come up with an agreement. Often the parents will need to say, okay, we hear your idea. This is our idea that we're going to need to stick with, but thank you for contributing, So, of course, we're the last say, but still everyone feels heard. and then we'll try the solution and then do a check-in a week later to see how we've been making progress as a family for whatever issue is coming up.
That's smart. And again, if you're just tuning into New England Lifestyles, I'm Mike Mullaney, and we are on with parenting expert Laura Lynn Knight, a former elementary school teacher, certified positive discipline educator, and she specializes in helping families create calmer home environments. She's also written for some of the places you've written for, parenting websites, Romper, Red Tricycle, stuff like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just did an article in Romper about tidying up the room, how to help kids tidy up their rooms, and creating that morning routine.
I got to read that one then. I've got to read that one.
Yes. That one was great because there were 4 of us experts that weighed in on the topic. So it was nice to get everyone's perspective.
Here's something that... it's basically about yelling, because yelling is just, it seems like it's such a regular part of so many households, and not just yelling about, screaming at each other, but like if someone has to do something, you just yell, hey, can someone bring me a new roll of toilet paper? Whatever it is, people are always yelling. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And because of that, there seems like every time there's a debate between kids, there seems to be escalations immediately because kids are still in that me phase. It's hard to get kids to buy into the team strategy. How do you do that? I mean, that's a big thing.
Yeah. Well, one of the ways is actually that family meeting that we were just talking about, because in that family meeting, you're teaching them problem-solving skills, working as a collective we. And so what's so interesting is I still have the younger kids, right? And I have heard them independently because we've been practicing this so long, where I'm not making this up. I mean, I couldn't believe it the first time I heard it, where my 2 children were starting to argue in their room. And one of them said, let's find a solution to this problem.
That's brilliant.
And I was blown away. I'm like, oh my gosh, this is working. Like, this is so incredible. So we can set the stage. I think so much of it is about modeling as the parents, because what we model, they follow.
Something, the idea that you're doing problem solving is so smart, because I just had a discussion, and you're an educator, you're a former elementary school teacher, so you understand this. We have become so oriented in schools to testing, but kids become much better and more proficient at virtually every discipline if, rather than just doing a lecture, you do problem solving. You know what I mean? Whether you do a problem solving thing in history, whether it be group projects on science, finding strategies and results in problem solving, it's such a key.
Yes, it's so important to practice that critical thinking. And even from a young age with kids, and I did this when my kids were young, and it was so helpful. It was one of the first parenting tools that I learned, because they hear so much all day, no, 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 and do, right? Go brush your teeth, go to bed, go eat dinner. And so simply switching the way that we talk to our children and asking them curiosity questions. What do you need to do to get ready for bed? What do you need to do to get out the door in the morning? What step needs to happen next? Those kinds of questions reframes it in their brain, and now all of a sudden they're critical thinkers. So when my child starts going into a whiny voice with me, and I want them to say please, instead of telling them, you need to change the tone of your voice right now, immediately I'm going to be in a power struggle, right? Because they don't want to change their tone. I can say, how can you talk so I can hear you? And they have to think about it. It forces a pause. Oh, how can I talk so Mom can hear me? Mom, may I please, watch a show or whatever it is.
Let me ask you this. So much of parenting, you end up creating so many, ultimatums and, setting up, I guess, consequences that you have to follow through on. That is not an easy thing. And I feel like as a parent, one of the things is I learned that over the course of time, I kept painting myself into corners, saying, if you do this, you're not going to have a sleepover. And then the night comes and the kid's heartbroken saying, seriously, I can't do this. I mean, we really need to think about what we're saying before we just say it off the cuff.
I know. Or you're say, if you do this, you won't watch a movie, and then you really want your kid to watch the movie because you wanted the break for yourself, but you have to follow through.
Or I'm taking your phone away from you for a week, and then you're like, oh, God almighty, this is not a good plan.
Yeah, it's hard. I really like natural consequences. I'm really a big believer in natural consequences. So if my child is not getting ready for bed, then we're not going to have enough time to do stories. That's a younger kid example, right? Or if my child isn't willing to eat their dinner, then they will go to bed and be a little bit hungry, and they can eat breakfast. And maybe tomorrow night they'll make a different decision. But it's a natural consequence in that it fits what's happening in the situation. I think sometimes parents get into this trap where the consequence really has nothing to do with what's happening. So you misbehaved at the park and now you can't watch a show tomorrow. Like, it's too disconnected.
It's hard. Let me ask you this, though. It's hard sometimes when a consequence comes to fruition. How do you go about not feeling guilty about a consequence? Like, for example, when my kids got to high school, I said, guys, I have to be to work. I'm leaving at 8:05. If you're not in the car, you're going to walk to school. And the first couple of times I had to leave my daughters, it freaked me out. And, I was told I was the world's worst parent and stuff. But there had to be a consequence. And after that, they were not late. It's hard, though.
Such perfect natural consequence. That the way that you executed that is beautiful because that relates, right? You had to go to work. You had to be somewhere on time. It was tough for them to walk maybe a few times. I bet they're not late very often anymore.
They're actually pretty good at that.
They learned it.
Yeah.
And so the way that I don't feel guilty in that moment, of course we have remorse. We want to do everything we can for our children. We want to always protect them. But letting them feel that discomfort is going to serve them later on because they know what dad says is true, right? So they have faith that you're going to follow through on what you say. And they're learning time management skills. And so that goes back to that. How do you want your kids to be when they're all grown up and they knock on the door? We want them to have time management skills, and you were help teaching that.
It's also interesting to see how kids, one of the things we have to learn to do as parents, and it's hard to do this, is give up certain things that we want when we think about what we want our kids to be. Like my wife, started her elementary school career as an immigrant who didn't speak English, was put into her first grade class, and the teacher said she'll figure it out. Kind of whacked out, right? But she ended up being the class valedictorian, right? Kind of crazy.
That's incredible.
But here's the thing. Now she is parenting, and she wants her kids to be perfect students, which they're not. They like to push stuff off. Drove her crazy because she knew how she did it. And she could not believe she could not impart that on these kids. But these kids ended up being honor roll students anyway because of just the way we valued education, how we worked with them and helped them with homework and stuff until, offering them the opportunity to be there. It's interesting how just because your kids aren't going to be exactly what you want them to be, it's still okay because they need to figure out their own path.
Yes, and it's so beautiful to let them figure out their own path because they surprise us in ways that, what we may have had planned is not necessarily the right way anyway, and maybe they thrive as honor roll students and maybe they're super creative and they end up inventing something that's going to really help make a significant difference in the world later on just through their creativity. So we don't know. And I think there's beauty in that. But what we do know is that we want them to have certain traits of kindness, empathy, compassion. And those are the fundamental values that when I work with parents that we really focus on. Where's that social emotional piece that we're teaching our children? And I have a big emphasis on the academics too because of my teaching background. But I always go back to the importance of just growing up in a home where you feel really heard and validated in your feelings.
It's good stuff. And one of the things that as I'm reading about you and what you do, one of the key words is calm. And I think everybody wants calm. It's like the essence of, most relationships, kids, what they want, what they need. Calm is not usually a part of it, but there's a good part of letting kids figure things out, figuring out what makes them chill, and getting to a place where you don't have to control the household, but let the household end up being what it is. If that means a kid wants to spend more time alone in their room than with the family, guess what? It's okay. Because a calm house is a good house for kids. When you think about it, what do you do to try to create those calmer environments at your house?
Yeah, so a lot of what we do is creating a space where we know that kids need to have routine and structure to feel calm and safe. So we're just kind of trying to decrease their nervous system when they're at home. Young kids, it's really helpful for them to just have a lot of playtime where they can just be immersed in toys and they work things out throughout the day, art supplies, that kind of stuff, where they just have these creative outlets. I also like to create a space for my children where they know they can go to have some cool down, calm down time. So my son has a little nook in his room. He's an avid reader, so he loves to read, and he'll go and just grab a book and sit there. And my daughter loves to do kinetic stand and play with water. And so we have some spaces outside for her where she can just go and chill and be by herself when she needs to. And so I think just creating an environment where the structure of the environment provides calm. And then the most important part of any of that is that the parents themselves is able to regulate their own emotions so that they are modeling calm. And that's the fundamental piece in all of this, is that we as parents get to learn tools so that we are in a calmer space, because that's really what's going to set the tone in the house. And
that's when I realize I'm the world's worst parent, because I'm one of these guys who I go from 0 to 100 in 1 second, and it's not any other reason than I'm just wired that way. And it's just, some of the kids act that way, some of them don't.
And our background has so much to do with it, and I think what really helps me is I look at it, instead of it being a moral thing, I like to look at it as the brain. So we have our prefrontal cortex. That's our rational thinking. That's the upper part of our brain. We have the lower part of our brain. That's where your amygdala is. That's in charge of fight, flight, freeze. And when I'm in a space where I'm about to go from 0 to 100, I say it to my kids, I say it to myself, that's my amygdala. Literally, my amygdala in my brain is firing. I am in the reptilian part of my brain. How am I going to get back into the prefrontal cortex, into the higher thinking part of my brain? And so I create with parents a pause poster. I do this for parents and kids. We write down things. Well, what helps you move from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex? For me, it's going on a walk. It's running cold water under my hands. It's taking a deep breath. It might be blowing bubbles for a kid. And hanging that poster up in the house where you can say, wow, I'm really going into this place. I'm going to pick a choice from this poster. I'm going to practice it. I'm going to calm down. I'm going to take a break, and then I'll revisit the issue.
Wow, you're
and then
good.
From a calming space, you can talk to your child, right? You don't ever have to fix the problem right then, unless they're in an emergency situation. And then you yell because they're about to get hit by a car or something.
Yeah, that happens.
Otherwise, you can revisit later.
I love these things. That is so good. And again, the idea of the meeting, though, being the kind of the fulcrum of everything. And when it comes down to it, someone once said this to me, and I thought it was so incredible. It was someone who was talking about keeping kids off drugs and alcohol. And he said the greatest tool in keeping your kids safe is the dining room table. And I said, wow. That's impressive. I said, no, every time, make sure you're all at the table. Make sure you have dinner together, because that is where conversations, it's a family meeting, whether they know it or not. And that's the thing. Kids will avoid a meeting, but they don't want to miss dinner. That dining room table can be everything. Knowing them strategies, as you said, having the family meeting, have it at dinner every night. That's a smart thing. And again, communicating with them is just so important.
I love that. My husband owns a drug and alcohol treatment center here in the Bay Area. And so he works with, it's actually 4 teens that struggle with drugs and alcohol and helping them get sober and get back, integrated into their life. And, what we know about addiction is that it's dopamine, right? They're searching for more dopamine. And so the question we can ask ourselves as families now is, how are we creating more dopamine? How are we creating a stability with dopamine levels in our children at home? And that's those comforting family dinners, after dinner saying, hey, who wants to play a game, for a few minutes on the ground together as a family? Let's make popsicles or whatever it is. I mean, it might seem silly, but every time we're doing that, we're nurturing the brain, we're nurturing their dopamine levels. And later on, they're not going to be searching for that somewhere else.
Yeah, we're big cookie makers at our house when,
Ooh,
it's a good thing. It's a good thing. Well, again, to learn more about Laura Lynn Knight, you can check out free parenting resources and sign up for her weekly calming newsletter, which I feel like I'm going to want to get in on. You can go to lauralynnKnight.com, and it's Laura, Linn, and Knight like a knight in shining armor, lauralynnKnight.com. Laura, it's been a pleasure speaking with you as parent to parent. Always a good thing.
Thank you so much. And it sounds like you're an amazing parent and your 3 kids are blessed to have you.
I have my moments.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Laura.
Thank you.